On August 20th, 1795, four men, General Arthur St. Clair, then governor of the Northwest Territory, Colonel Israel Ludlow, General James Wilkinson, and Jonathan Dayton, a lawyer, soldier, and statesman who had a hand in crafting the U.S. Constitution, paid 83 cents an acre for the Miami lands, thus agreeing to establish a permanent settlement on 60,000 acres at the mouth of the Mad River. On November 4th, Ludlow laid out the new village. He named streets after himself, St. Clair and Wilkinson. Ludlow also named the town after his friend and colleague, Jonathan Dayton. On April 1st, 1796, the first permanent settlers arrived from nearby Cincinnati. Ironically, Jonathan Dayton is not known to have ever visited the town that bore his name. In 1798, a man named William Robinson is believed to have visited the Dayton settlement as a member of the Transylvania Presbytery, with the authority to organize a Presbyterian church. And a year later, these words found in a history book indicate the beginnings of an actual church. The first Presbyterian church, under the care of the Washington Presbytery Synod of Kentucky, was organized in 1799. 1 year later, in 1800, a small log cabin is built by the hands of 10 Presbyterians at the northeast corner of 3rd and Main Streets. That would be called the First Presbyterian Church, the first organized church in the new town of Dayton. 200 years later, this church, now known as Westminster Presbyterian Church, and located a few blocks away at the corner of 1st and Wilkinson Streets, is still seen as a spiritual leader in the now nearly 1 million residents that occupy the greater Dayton metropolitan area. Through its 200 years, the church has experienced triumph and tragedy, growth and change, war and peace, all the while increasing the love of God and neighbor. From humble roots in a tiny cabin to a majestic cathedral, this is the story of Westminster Presbyterian Church.
First Presbyterian Church called its first minister of the Word in 1804, Dr. James Welsh. Dr. Welsh was also a physician, druggist, and land surveyor.
This is a model of the first church that was built in 1799. Remember that the forerunners of the Westminster Presbyterian Church were the first church in Dayton. And some of you may be looking at me a little askance there because you say, well, is that a model? This is the true model. Actually, there were no chinking between the logs, nor were there any windows. I guess they depended on the light coming through between the logs to provide something so that they could see. I'm sure that you were no fair weather Christians at that time because you'd have to be pretty hardy to sit through some of our winters here in Dayton in a church of this type. Then they made some kind of a deal with the county where they could meet in the courthouse, which stood where the present courthouse stands at the corner of 3rd and Main.
Since the town's new brick courthouse was not ready for another year, the congregation held services in the courtroom of Colonel Newcomb's Tavern. This two-story log house, founded by early Dayton settler Colonel George Newcomb, was also used as a tavern, inn, courthouse, and jail, as well as First Church's meeting place. Colonel Newcomb's Tavern stands today at the Caroline Historical Park, just south of downtown Dayton. In 1798, only 2 years after the town was formed, it became known that the early settler and founder John Cleves Symes had been unable to secure a title from the United States government, and thus suddenly the settlers did not own the acreage they had cleared. Daniel Cooper wrote to the United States Congress, passionately arguing the case for the dispossessed settlers who had worked so hard to clear their land and raise cabins. Dr. Welch left rather suddenly in the spring of 1817 due to strong opposition led by none other than First Church member Daniel Cooper. Cooper and Dr. Welch became drawn into a heated newspaper controversy. Cooper accused Welch with unfeeling conduct toward patients and professional colleagues, with cheating at church elections, and with forcing himself as pastor upon the church. Dr. Welch left Dayton to accept a call to Vevey, Indiana, where he preached and practiced medicine until his death in 1825. As for Daniel Cooper, famous early Dayton figure, his destiny met a cruel and unusual fate shortly after Welch's departure.
He had purchased a bell, I understand. He paid for it himself, as I understand it. And it arrived at the stage. He gathered it up and put it on his wheelbarrow and pushed it all the way to 2nd and Ludlow, and suffered a heart attack and died later because of his exertion.
Daniel Cooper would die on July 13, 1818, at age 45, and just 7 months after the first service that was held at the new First Presbyterian Church. 18 years later, his son, David Z. Cooper, deeded a public square as Dayton's first public park in honor of his father.
In the 1820s, there was a split in the entire Presbyterian Church, and then, of course, it was here in Dayton also. And the split was over slavery and some other theological questions, and it was known as the old school and the new school of thought.
In regards to the passionate issue of slavery, the new school supported the abolitionist movement, while the old school was more conservative in its views.
A large group of people left the church and established another church on 3rd Street at the corner of 3rd and Ludlow.
Construction began on their new building in 1838 and was officially dedicated on March 25, 1840, as the 3rd Street Presbyterian Church, located a mere block away from First Church. The oldest established church in Dayton had divided in two.
One of the interesting facts about some of the ministers here that you might be interested in who have served Westminster through the years, Phineas D. Gurley. He was here during the 1850s and then went to Washington and became the minister for Abraham Lincoln, his spiritual advisor, it is said, and was the person who was the minister at his funeral services. That church lasted until the 1840s, when they then tore it down and built another building on the same spot with a very high spire on it, and that lasted until 1869, and then they took that one down and built another building.
In 1899, First Church observed its 100th anniversary, culminating with a 3-day celebration that was described in their centenary book as a veritable Presbyterian love feast. The Reverend Charles A. Campbell began his ministry with 3rd Street Church in 1908 and was on hand when the church staged elaborate ceremonies to celebrate its 75th anniversary. A new church had been built in 1881, and by this time membership had risen to near 700 from the original 69 back in 1839. Dayton newspapers paid this tribute to 3rd Street by saying that, "From the time of its organization, the church has been a tower of strength in this community and has exerted a powerful influence in directing the policy of Presbyterianism throughout the country." On Easter Sunday, March 23, 1913, rain began to fall on the Miami Valley and the city of Dayton. By Tuesday, the 25th, a great flood appeared to be imminent. By March 27, nearly 4 trillion gallons of rain had fallen over the entire region, and downtown Dayton was 12 feet underwater. The final toll of the flood would be $100 million in damage, 1,000 homes destroyed, and more than 300 deaths. The death toll would have been much higher if not for the efforts by the NCR boats, which rescued another 10,000 people. Of the two Presbyterian churches, 3rd Street suffered the greater loss. Work in the church and all its departments was suspended entirely until April 21. Dayton and the Miami Valley would take years to recover from this disaster. In the year of our Lord, 1919, the nation was only a year removed from what we hoped would be the first and only World War. President Woodrow Wilson, himself a lifelong Presbyterian, was in his second term as president. In 1919, he would both receive the Nobel Peace Prize and suffer a massive stroke that would debilitate his remaining years in office.
The First Presbyterian Church of Dayton, Ohio, after a continuous existence of 120 years, and the 3rd Street Presbyterian Church of Dayton, after a continuous existence of 81 years, decided last Wednesday night to unite as one congregation. The spirit of our day is not competition between churches, but cooperation. They will be able to accomplish more for the God they serve than they could possibly do as individual churches.
They chose the name Westminster in honor of the long association the name had with the rich history of the Presbyterian Church. It was at Westminster Abbey in London where leading ministers and laypeople had gathered to consider a restatement of church doctrines, later to be known as the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Reverend Edward Clippinger resigned as pastor of the 3rd Street Church and became pastor of the newly formed Westminster. He would stay on as pastor until October 1922, as the pulpit committee searched for an acceptable pastor who would be faced with both a new church construction as well as the blending together of two congregations. The person chosen for this daunting task was Dr. Hugh Ivan Evans, who would preach his first sermon on December 2nd, 1923. The newly merged church, Westminster, would worship together initially at Memorial Hall as the new church was being built at their site on 1st Street between Wilkinson and Perry Streets.
I'm Harriet Carr. I've been a member here for quite a few years. The cornerstone service was held on 1st Street, and I was just a little tiny kid running back and forth while my parents were sitting there watching, and then I saw the choir come out.
Dr. Evans read a list of articles pertaining to Dayton's past to be put in the cornerstone. In a very symbolic act, two men representing the two old churches sealed the cornerstone: Thomas Elder from 3rd Street and Joseph F. Perrine of First Church, now elders emeritus of the new Westminster Church.
I was in the dedication service wearing my choir robe, and I carried a silver bread tray down the aisle to the altar. In back of me and scaring me were 4 young men carrying groups of wine trays. It was just a lovely day and a lovely experience, and the place was an awful lot of people in it. People were happy.
Dr. Evans would continue as pastor of Westminster until 1955. In his 32 years of ministry, Dr. Evans was estimated to have baptized nearly 1,000 children, to have performed nearly 2,000 marriages, and to have received over 3,000 members for the church. He was noted for his optimism and hopefulness during the trying time of the Great Depression, throwing in an outstanding sense of humor for good measure. His wife, Edith Bean Evans, was his loyal companion, and who, with imagination, vigor, understanding, and enthusiasm, played an important part in their ministry.
When we were here, Dr. Evans was still here. He was a marvelous man. I think he inspired all of us.
Dr. Hugh Ivan Evans died in 1958, just 3 years after his retirement from Westminster. For the next 40 years, both Dayton and Westminster would go through many changes with both high and low times as more and more residents moved to the neighboring suburbs. Immediately following Dr. Evans' retirement, Reverend James Westhaver moved from assistant pastor to become co-pastor with the Reverend Joseph Jensen. This co-pastorate would last for 7 years.
Joe Jensen was the one that I liked better because he was the funny one. Joe used to wrap me up in his robes. He would take his robe and wrap me up and hide me and play games that way, and I do remember that.
Well, I was very distressed that all the guests would come and see all these huge crates parked there in the church narthex. So I complained to Jim Westhaver. I said, "Oh, Jim, this is gonna look so bad." And he said, "Oh, Winnie, don't worry. Everyone will think that these are wedding gifts for Sue and Mike."
From 1963 to 1972, Dr. Frederick B. Speakman, a renowned preacher and author, would pastor Westminster.
One Easter Sunday we came here, and Dr. Speakman was preaching, and he always did a very dramatic Easter sermon. And the combination of his sermon and the music and the fact that our daughter was about a year old, we said, well, look, let's just stop looking around and settle here.
Dr. William Schramm became pastor in 1974 and would stay at Westminster until his retirement in 1987.
He reminded me of someone who could be your grandfather, your godfather, and the chairman of the board, all rolled into one.
Dr. Schramm was a master politician, and I was on the session with Dr. Schramm.
Sermon was extraordinary. So was the postlude. People clapped after the postlude. I couldn't figure that out.
And I'd marvel at how well Bill Schramm could manage different kinds of people and keep things moving.
I figured out why they applauded, too. Somebody said it was for the music and the organist, and somebody else said it was a delayed reaction to the sermon. Take your pick.
Dr. Schramm is currently Westminster's pastor emeritus. Dr. Robert Lowry led the church through the late 1980s into the beginning of the 90s. This marked an uneven time of transition in the life of Westminster. In describing Dr. Lowry's ministry, church members stated that he was, quote, a warm and welcoming person and someone who handled a difficult time with dignity and grace. By 1993, the Reverend Sandy Mcconnell was called to Westminster as its new pastor. As the church went through its various changes in those 40 years, many dedicated associate pastors, interim pastors, and other staff members, too numerous to list, gave valuable service to Westminster in helping maintain a high level of excellence in ministry to their congregation and community.
I feel that these are my friends. When I lost my husband, they were right there. I mean, I just feel like I had family here.
It's been my life growing up in a place where you could always come and not feel threatened by society and your social stature. It didn't matter what kind of clothes you wore or who you talked to. It was always a family kind of environment.
I just think it's amazing the love that everyone here has for each other, and it's really made me grow a lot stronger in my faith.
And in the 63 years that I've been a member, the church has been my rock of Gibraltar.
I was gone for a couple of years, as I said, in Florida. The thing I missed most in that time was the Westminster, its fellowship, its culture, its programs, and its people. Oh, I made friends in Florida. I had friends there. But I couldn't come away from a worship service feeling the same way I did here.
When I think of what makes Westminster stand out, I think of its music program.
The music program is particularly, well, not only outstanding, remarkable, but it's just terrific.
The Westminster Choir itself began in 1920 under the direction of John Finley Williamson. In 1926, the choir had toured the United States and Europe. They rapidly outgrew the facility and moved to the conservatory in Ithaca, New York, and then to Princeton, New Jersey, where it was known as Westminster Choir College, and it is there now, and it is a division of Rider College.
I think that as a church, we are challenged and are trying to become more relational. I think there's a return to spirituality in America and a need and a crying out for a relationship with God. And certainly that's been part of Westminster's roots, and I think it again will be on the forefront of where this church will be as part of their personality and their thrust.
We started with 5 people being trained as small group leaders. And I had read a lot about small groups, talked to people about small groups, but hadn't experienced what this kind of model of small group could be. What was incredible is that our 4th time together, this small group gelled as a small group. Myself and those 4 leaders saw what a small group could be all about and went out and started small groups and have had similar kinds of experience where relationships between each other have grown stronger and also the relationship with God has increased. And that's been exciting to see.
People who come here to worship and who are really attentive, who aren't just going through the motions, but who are thinking and praying and really attempting to grow in their faith. Within the folds of this inclusive church, there will be a place for everyone who loves the Lord Jesus Christ and who wants to render service to Him. The church rejoices in its past, but its past is not its greatest glory. That lies in its future. Tomorrow calls. It bids us let the light of the future fall upon our faces. It asks us to rise and build a greater church, not forgetting the cabin from which it springs. The church moves towards the wider usefulness of a building which has no walls, no limits, no barriers, a place where there is no distinction of social class or race or family, to put limits to its growth. In short, its future is bound up with the ideals of the kingdom of heaven on earth.